Now, in this video, we're wrapping up the Theaetetus. That is, we're on to the fourth and final definition of knowledge. So we're at Theaetetus, right at the tail end of the dialogue, 201 to 2010. Part one, so there's going to be a second part to my discussion of this section. Our fourth definition of knowledge, remember the third definition was knowledge is true belief, and Theaetetus accepted our jury argument that said knowledge is not true belief. So on to the fourth definition, knowledge is true belief plus a logos. All right, so logos in the original Greek and in the transliteration, logos. All right, so we've got the jury argument, getting the true belief, third definition out of the way. Knowledge is, not that this is completely rejected, but knowledge is more than just true belief. So Plato and Socrates are not saying that knowledge is not at all related to true belief. Yes, it is. What they're saying is that it's more than that. So true belief is not sufficient. Necessary, it seems, but not sufficient. We probably are safe if we assume that. Okay, but the thing is when you say, all right, for our fourth definition, knowledge is true belief plus a logos, what is this? What is this logos? What is this, quote unquote, more than that, something that has to supplement true belief to get us across the equivalent sign to full-blown knowledge? Well, it's pretty wide and wide open here, because the term logos in the original Greek has a huge number of meanings. It means all kinds of things. You know, and so in various texts, they will interpret it or use it in different ways. So it's not clear immediately what's going on here. But just as a background, to give you a little taste as to how complex the story is I mean, I'll begin with something relatively familiar. If you go into the Gospel of John, into the Bible, into the New Testament, you have that, that notion of in the beginning there was the Word. Well, that's a translation. The original Greek talks about in the arche, in the beginning, arche was the logos, right? And so then that's linked up with all kinds of theological notions. And of course that ties into the complexity of the triune God and all that really difficult philosophical theology that's embedded in that text. And yet it's that word, logos. So it can even mean something that is divine and really complicated theologically speaking. So that's just that's a wee taste. Now that is in Koine Greek, so that's a little bit later than the Greek that Aristotle would have been using, which is probably closer, we could say, to Homeric. But that's getting a lot more into the history of the Greek language itself. But just roughly, it's got a huge number of meanings in Greek. It can mean things like speech, just regular talking. It can mean discourse in general, like, language in general, talking in general. It can mean something like, a logos can be like statements about some particular thing or general statements. It can mean that as well. It can also refer to speech acts, like, for example, the making of an argument. And remember, an argument isn't the same thing as a dialogue or banter. An argument is where someone is like making a case, like we think of a lawyer making an argument on behalf of a client or against the defendant. That could be a logos as well. A logos also, and this is sort of coming in closer to what's going on in logos in this connection with knowledge and true belief. Remember, the whole game is to come up with something that explicates the concept that we originate is, what is episteme, right? What is knowledge? Well, we're trying to unpack it. We've got true belief, and we haven't even unpacked what truth is. That's a thorny one, but one thing at a time. We haven't really unpacked what a belief is. Again, one thing at a time. But we know it's something beyond a thesis, above, or something other than perception, something of thought, talking to the mind, the soul talking to itself. But now we're trying to figure out logos. In this sense, it's closer to a theory, an explanation, not so much a definition. But we're moving into theory territory. or explanation. Theories and explanations aren't identical, but that's roughly the terrain we're moving in. And finally, a logos can mean a list or a tally. And we'll see that a little bit here as well, where a logos is kind of an enumeration. And we've also seen attempts to use enumeration in the explication of episteme, way back at the beginning of the dialogue, right? That was Theaetetus' first response to what is episteme, and he gave all those examples, and Socrates says, nah, that's not what we're looking for. So that tells you a little bit of, well, if you start using the enumerative approach here for a logos, you're more or less replicating some earlier discussions that went awry, so it's not surprising that when that's brought back, it's not going to be successful either. So there is a sense of repetition in the dialogue, but it is arguably at a higher level because now we're talking about it in the context of a more fleshed out definition than what we had earlier. So this is also a dramatic device that knits the various pieces of the dialogue very nicely together and serves to reinforce it in the audience's mind. Because remember, it's like a play. We're the audience. All right. So what we can think of now is adding the logos, this whatever this is thing, you know, and also like I may from time to time write it out like TB plus L, so true belief plus logos as our definition of knowledge. So we're moving towards, and I want to introduce this notion of a justified true belief. That's really what we're getting after, because I talked about in a previous video that true belief fell a little flat because you could be lucky and just guess what's going on. I gave an example about birds on top of a building, but you could be a very good guesser. And what do we mean by good guesser? Well, you just happen to guess correctly, but we wouldn't say you have knowledge. So if you guessed all the time, if you were a scientist and you were just constantly guessing, and you know, imagine if Einstein said, oh, I don't know, I just guessed that the world was structured that way, and well, I'm really shocked that it turned out to be correct. We would say, well, you didn't really know, that was just a lucky guess. So knowledge has to be more than accidentally related to truth. It can't just be a true belief that just this happens, you just happen to come up with it. It has to be related in a non-arbitrary way. This idea of trying to unpack a link of a true belief with knowledge requires some sort of infrastructure. That's what we mean when we start talking about justification, when we say, yeah, but how did you know that? You were right, but how did you know it? So this is going to prove to be a very thorny discussion. In the 20th century, talking about justification has been, well, it's a cottage industry. You can look up justification and you will find, starting with roughly in the 60s with Ernst Gettier's paper on knowledge is justified true belief, he has this very short discussion where it doesn't work, knowledge is justified true belief, and it all turned on trying to unpack the notion of justification for true belief in order to get it to match up with our intuitions of what is knowledge. And that is proven to be an extremely difficult endeavor. As a matter of fact, people propose all kinds of conditions of justification, and they seem to work for some cases, and then someone constructs a counterexample, and then you're back in the same thing. Well, it seems to work for this, but it doesn't work for that. And it becomes a kind of a cat and mouse game. All right, so that's how this discussion of what knowledge is still very much alive today. And it's largely inspired by what Plato has done. Now, just as an aside, yeah, we get ready for this discussion of justification and this more complex examination of episteme, or knowledge. But just as an aside, it seems you can point to other dialogues other than the Theaetetus, where it seems, and take this very seriously, it seems that Plato accepts this definition that knowledge is true belief plus a logos. In the Theaetetus, he thinks it fails. Socrates is going to critique it. We'll look at that a little bit later. But for now, it seems that you can find in other dialogues, Meno. These are the Stephanus numbers. And Meno 98, Symposium 202, Phaedo in a couple of places, 76, 97 to 99, and in the masterwork, The Republic, seems like he accepts it. This is always a point of contention. How do you read these dialogues? If the Theaetetus is later, maybe Socrates, or well, Plato has articulated a position here, changed his mind later. It's hard to say. And also, let us never forget that the Theaetetus, as well as Plato's other dialogues, but I think especially the Theaetetus, it is a dialogue that is involved in a lot of pedagogy, because the star of the dialogue is Socrates, but the main point is the education of Theaetetus. So this dialogue, could be the education, the training of Theaetetus. So maybe Socrates or Plato has a different agenda to push here. All right. With that being said, the section that I'm talking about here, 201 to 210, can be broken into two main parts. And these are both examinations of knowledge equals this justified true belief, or true belief plus a logos. And the two parts are commonly referred to as, part one is commonly referred to as Socrates' dream. And the other one is three different, referred to roughly, the three different interpretations of logos. Now, I'll dig into them in a later video. I'm just going to make a few comments about this, is that with Socrates' dream, there is another, shall we say, another device of how Plato is knitting different pieces of the dialogue together. So it's always good to enjoy the form and the structure of it, because that's to help consolidate the points of the dialogues in our minds. And there is a parallel here with the Homo Mensura thesis. And if you don't remember what that is, go back and look at the videos there. I discussed that. But the Homo Mensura thesis is from Protagoras, right? Man is the measure of all things. We talked about that in quite a bit of detail. And remember, Socrates, when it was proposed as something to be examined in the context of knowledge, Socrates went off on a digression into the metaphysics of the world, trying to explain what the world had to be like in order, that is, what the world itself was like in order for the Homo Mensura thesis to be true. So what would the metaphysics, or if you like, or the ontology, the structure of the world have to be like for this Homo Mensura thesis to come out true? And if you recall, roughly, it turns out that the world has to be a kind of flux, and that led into the Heraclitean argument. Well, that methodology of looking at what the world would have to be like for a proposal to be true, and then looking at the problems of that world, as we saw in the flux world, it engendered all kinds of difficulties. The destruction of meaning was one of them. Socrates does that here too. So he looks at it and says, well, if we say that knowledge is true belief plus a logos is true, if we want to say that, we ask, well, what's the world going to be like if knowledge, if knowledge is defined as a true belief plus logos? What's the world got to be like if that's true, as we did for the Homo Mensura thesis? So there's a link again between epistemology and ontology, or metaphysics. And the ontology proposed here, the metaphysics that's proposed here, comes out in Socrates' dream. So that's what I'm trying to point out, is that, like the Homo Mensura thesis example, we have a discussion of what must the world be like in order for this definition to be true, and then we look at that and go, wow, if the world were really like that, look at all these other problems it engenders, so we get rid of it. So these two will fail. This one fails in a very similar way that we saw the Homo Mensura thesis fail. So what Socrates says, that really it's his dream, and I'll articulate it in a little bit more detail later, it has to do with seeing the world as some kind of set of simples. And so what we're looking at in the fourth definition here in Socrates' dream is knowledge is true belief plus a world has a metaphysics of simples. And there's a lot of, again, like all these discussions in the Theaetetus, there's tons of literature on it all. So what I want to do here with you is just give you a rough arguably fairly orthodox, not too fancy of an interpretation, of what I think is going on here, that allows you to get a feel for the text, and then you can always explore it and all the difficulties and all the other kinds of interpretations in the philosophical literature. But there is some definitely dark points in here, and by dark I just mean they're unclear. Theaetetus around 201D says that somebody once told him that knowledge is true belief plus a logos, which kickstarts this all, and Socrates goes okay, and he says that there are things that there's no account are not knowable, and things that have an account are things that are knowable. Now, that's a pretty dark statement, because what are you talking about when there are things that there's no account of them? What is that? Like, Z is not knowable because Z lacks an account. How would you know that, right? How would you know? If you say something is totally unknowable, how would you be able to say that it lacks an account or not? It seems you'd have to know something about that thing in order to say whether it lacks or whatever. You're talking about properties of something that you said you have no idea of the properties. So you just have to say Z's unknowable, or I can't even talk about it in any way. So there are some mini little, shall we say, mini discussions going on here, which are fairly subtle, and hence the people say, well, this has import. You can't discuss the whole section without bringing all this stuff in. And it just makes it all the much more fun, more interesting, but at the same time, much more complicated. So I'm not going to dig into all the fascinating details. What I'm just going to do is look at these basic, shall we say, this basic picture and these three different interpretations of logos in order to understand what the final attempt here is in this discussion, which rounds out the end of the dialogue. So, what's Socrates' dream all about? Stay tuned.